She had survived boardroom coups, hostile takeovers, and a father who treated her like a chess piece. But nothing, not a single thing in 30 years of her carefully armored life, prepared Evelyn Sterling for the question her 6-year-old daughter whispered inside a glittering Manhattan ballroom. The little girl had simply stopped walking, the way children do when something cuts through all the noise and lands directly in their chest. She stared across the crowded room at a man in a plain dark suit standing near the far wall. A man with a scar along his jaw and eyes that looked impossibly like hers. Then Clara looked up and asked the question that made Evelyn's entire world stop turning. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what comes next will shake you to your core. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to stay with you. The Waldorf's grand ballroom had been transformed into something that cost more money than most people earned in a lifetime. Crystal chandeliers threw warm light across 500 guests in evening gowns and tailored suits, and the low hum of string quartet music wove through the sound of carefully maintained conversations, the kind where nobody said exactly what they meant and everyone knew it. Evelyn Sterling moved through it like she always did. Head up, posture perfect, a glass of sparkling water held loosely in her right hand because she didn't drink at public events. Not anymore. She had learned years ago that alcohol at charity galas had a way of making people honest. And honesty in rooms like this one was the most dangerous thing you could carry. She was 30 years old and looked every bit the part of a woman who had built something from wreckage. The papers called her the Sterling heiress who saved Sterling Industries. She hated that phrase. She hadn't saved anything. She had simply refused to let it collapse, which was a different thing entirely, and the distinction mattered to her even if it mattered to no one else. Her assistant, Marcus, was somewhere to her left, fielding a conversation about the foundation's third-quarter numbers. Her head of communications, Dana, was near the entrance managing a small situation involving a reporter who hadn't been on the approved guest list. These were manageable problems. Evelyn had built a life around manageable problems. Clara was at her side, which was where Clara always was at events like this. The little girl was 6 years old and possessed an unusual quality that Evelyn had noticed almost from the moment she could walk. She watched people. Not the way children usually watched people, with fidgety curiosity or the desire to be noticed. Clara watched with a quiet, almost unsettling focus, like she was filing information away somewhere that Evelyn couldn't access. Tonight she wore a navy dress with white trim because she'd refused the pink one, and her dark hair had been pulled back by Evelyn's housekeeper, Elena, into something that had lasted approximately 40 minutes before half of it escaped. Evelyn had stopped trying to fix it. The child had strong opinions. They were moving toward the far side of the room, toward the table where the Sterling Industries board members were seated, when Clara stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The way you stop when something grabs you by the collar. Evelyn took another half step before she registered the absence of the small hand in hers. She turned. Clara was standing completely still, her gaze fixed on something across the ballroom. Her chin was slightly lifted, the way it got when she was concentrating very hard on something she couldn't quite explain. Clara. Evelyn kept her voice low and even. Come on, sweetheart. We need to… Mom. Something in Clara's voice made Evelyn stop talking. It wasn't distress exactly. It was something quieter and stranger than distress. Mom, why does that man look like me? Evelyn turned to follow her daughter's gaze. Across the crowded room, near the secondary entrance that led to the service corridor, a man stood with his back partially against the wall. He was wearing a plain dark suit, security, she realized, from the earpiece and the subtle positioning that kept him angled toward the room rather than toward any single conversation. I was broad through the shoulders with the kind of stillness that came from deliberate training rather than ease. A faint scar ran along the left side of his jaw, starting somewhere near his ear and trailing toward his chin. He was looking at a point somewhere past the string quartet, not at them. Evelyn almost looked away. Then she saw his eyes. Even at this distance, there was something about the shape of them, deep-set, dark, slightly heavy-lidded, that sent a cold ripple through her chest. She told herself it was a coincidence. Children made strange connections all the time. Clara had once spent 20 minutes insisting that their doorman looked like the talking dog from a cartoon she'd watched twice. But then Clara shifted slightly on her feet, and the light caught the small crescent-shaped mark beneath her daughter's right eye. The mark she'd had since birth. The mark that Evelyn's father had always called a birthmark, and waved away whenever the pediatrician asked about it. Evelyn looked back at the man across the room. Beneath his right eye, in exactly the same position, was an identical mark. The sparkling water in her hand suddenly felt very heavy. The man's gaze moved, the slow, methodical sweep of someone trained to read a room rather than enjoy it. And then it stopped. He was looking at Clara. Ryan Cole had learned long ago that the body knows things before the mind catches up. It was something the instructors used to say back in Buds, back when he was 22 years old and convinced he could endure anything. Your gut processes faster than your brain. Trust it. His gut had been sending him something for the past 30 seconds that he couldn't explain. He had taken this job because the agency called and he needed the work, and it was a Saturday night in November, and Eli was staying at the Garcia's place down the street. The event itself was exactly what he expected. Rich people performing generosity for each other in a room that cost more to decorate than his entire block. He wasn't cynical about it exactly. He just knew what it was. He'd been doing security work for 3 years. It paid, it used skills he already had, and it didn't require him to think very hard about anything beyond reading a room and staying awake. Those were things Ryan was still good at, even when he wasn't good at much else. He was on his third circuit of the perimeter when something pulled his attention toward the center of the room. Not a threat. He'd cataloged every person in this room within the first 20 minutes. He couldn't help it. It was wired into him now, probably permanently. This was different. This was a child, standing still in the middle of a moving crowd, looking directly at him with the kind of focus that most adults couldn't manage. He looked back. The child was small, maybe 5 or 6, in a navy dress with her dark hair half loose. She had serious eyes and a straight, unafraid posture that was unusual for a kid surrounded by strangers. And then she tilted her head slightly, and the light shifted, and Ryan saw the small crescent mark beneath her right eye. His mind went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with training. He'd had that mark his entire life. His mother used to call it his little moon. It was faint enough that most people didn't notice it until they knew to look. But once you knew, you couldn't unsee it. He had never met anyone else who had it. A woman appeared at the child's side, tall, dark-haired, wearing something simple and dark that probably cost more than Ryan's truck. She said something to the girl, but the girl didn't move. The woman turned to follow the child's gaze, and Ryan saw her face clearly for the first time. Something happened in his chest that he had no clean word for. He knew that face. He knew the angle of it, the particular way she held her jaw when she was processing something unexpected. He knew the precise shade of dark that her eyes turned when she was frightened and trying not to show it. He also knew, with absolute certainty, that Evelyn Hartwell, Evelyn Sterling, apparently, because the logo on the event's backdrop matched the name on the building he'd driven past 100 times, was looking at him like she'd seen something that was rearranging everything she thought she understood about her own life. Ryan had spent 7 years trying to forget a woman he'd spent 3 months loving and the rest of his adult life trying to outrun the absence of. He had told himself, eventually, that she had moved on, that she had made a choice, that whatever they'd had was something that happened during a specific kind of desperate time, the kind of time that didn't survive contact with real life. He had been wrong about a lot of things, but he had never let himself be wrong about that, because the alternative was something he couldn't afford to sit with. Now he was standing in a ballroom in Manhattan, looking at a 6-year-old child with his eyes and his mark and his particular way of standing very still in a room full of noise. His hand, hanging at his side, closed slowly into a fist. Evelyn's first instinct was to move Clara away. Fast, professionally, without drama. She put her hand on her daughter's shoulder and said quietly, "We need to find our table, baby." "He's looking at me," Clara said. She didn't sound scared. She sounded interested, which was somehow worse. "A lot of people look at you. Come on." "Mom, he has my mark." Evelyn's hand tightened slightly on Clara's shoulder. She said nothing. Marcus appeared at her elbow with the particular brand of discreet urgency that she'd trained him to project over 3 years. "The board chairman is asking if you have a moment before dinner." "Give me 5 minutes," Evelyn said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. Marcus looked at her, registered something in her expression, and vanished without another word. She was trying to think clearly, which was what she was good at. She was trying to run the logic of what she was seeing and find the point at which it stopped making sense. It had to stop making sense somewhere. That mark could be coincidence. A similar birthmark on a stranger's face, pattern recognition doing what human brains always did. Clara was a child with an active imagination and no filter between what she observed and what she said out loud. But the eyes were harder to explain away. And then the man moved. He wasn't walking toward them. He was doing the opposite, stepping to the side, angling himself so he was partially blocked by a group of guests moving toward the bar, giving them space. She had a sudden irrational sense that he was doing it deliberately, that he understood exactly what was happening across this room and was trying to make it easier for her to pretend it wasn't. And then her eyes caught something she hadn't noticed before, around Clara's neck, on the thin silver chain she'd worn since infancy, because Evelyn's own mother had clasped it there the week after Clara was born, hung a small silver pendant. A delicate thing, barely a centimeter across. A crescent moon, polished to a fine edge, with a single tiny star at its tip. Evelyn had always assumed it had been her mother's. Her mother had given it with no explanation beyond it belongs with her, and Evelyn had never pressed for more because her mother had been dying, and there were more important things to hold on to. She had never thought to question it. Now she watched the man across the room, Ryan, her mind said, his name surfacing through 7 years of deliberate burial. And she saw him register the pendant the exact moment she did. She watched something shift in the lines of his face, a small, devastating kind of recognition. Not surprise. Confirmation. Like a man who had spent years not allowing himself to hope for something, and had just discovered that the hope had been there all along, waiting for him to look directly at it. Evelyn grabbed Clara's hand. "We're going to our table," she said. "But now, Clara." She didn't run. Evelyn Sterling did not run across ballrooms, but she walked with the kind of focused speed that got her through boardrooms when things were collapsing, and she didn't look back, not once, even though every nerve in her body was screaming at her to. She found their table. She sat down. She smoothed her dress and picked up the menu card that had been placed precisely in front of her chair and stared at it without reading a single word on it. Clara settled into the chair beside her, picked up the small dessert fork, examined it with great interest, and set it back down. "He knew about the necklace," Clara said quietly. Evelyn looked at her daughter. "What?" He saw it, and his face changed. Clara touched the pendant at her throat with 2 small fingers, the same gesture Evelyn had seen her make 1,000 times since she was old enough to reach for things. "He knew about it." "Clara, I'm not scared of him." Clara looked up at her with those eyes that were undeniably not entirely Evelyn's. "He didn't look scary. He looked—" She thought about it for a moment, her brow folding in the way it did when she was searching for the right word, and refused to settle for an approximate one. "Sad." Evelyn did not trust herself to answer that. Across the room, she heard a low voice, not Ryan's, but one of her own security staff, asking someone to step back from the main floor. She didn't turn around. She already knew what had happened. She'd given no order, but her team knew how to read her, and someone had moved to place themselves between her table and wherever Ryan Cole was standing. A minute passed, maybe 2. And then she heard it from across the room, carrying through a brief gap in the music with a clarity that had no right to reach her. A man's voice. Low, slightly rough at the edges, like someone who had learned to speak carefully in situations where every word mattered. "Take care of your mother, kid." Clara's head turned toward the sound. But when Evelyn finally let herself look, the place by the far wall where Ryan Cole had been standing was empty. He was gone. Clara stared at the empty space for a long moment. Then she turned back to the table and placed both hands flat on the white tablecloth in front of her, with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had just made a private decision. Evelyn watched her daughter's face, and felt for the first time in years the particular cold weight of a thing she had spent her entire adult life refusing to carry. Not grief exactly, not guilt. Something older and more stubborn than both. The feeling of a question she had never let herself fully ask. The DNA test was Evelyn's idea, and she hated herself for it. Not because it was wrong, because it was necessary, and necessary things that also felt like betrayals had a particular way of sitting in her stomach that no amount of discipline could fix. She had ordered it Sunday morning, 2 days after the gala, using a private medical service that she paid for out of her personal account, rather than the company's, the kind of arrangement that left no paper trail inside Sterling Industries and required the discretion of exactly one person she trusted completely. Dr. Nora Vance had been her private physician for 4 years. She asked no questions beyond what the test required. She collected Clara's sample while the little girl was distracted by a cartoon on the tablet Evelyn let her use only during medical appointments, and she had the results processed through a laboratory that billed under a name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know what it meant. Evelyn spent those 2 days running Sterling Industries at full capacity and behaving, to everyone around her, exactly as she always did. She chaired a meeting about the Singapore acquisition on Monday morning. She reviewed the foundation's annual report over lunch. She answered 47 emails and made 11 phone calls, and had a 20-minute argument with the head of legal about a contract clause that was going to cost them either money or time, and she'd decided it would cost them time. Clara went to school. Clara came home. Clara asked, on Monday evening at dinner, whether the man from the party had a family. Evelyn said she didn't know. Clara considered this, twirled her pasta around her fork with a focused concentration she gave to very few things, and said, "He seemed like he would be good at it." Evelyn asked her what she meant. "At having a family," Clara said, as if this were obvious. "Some people look like they're good at it, and some people don't. He looked like he would be." Evelyn changed the subject. Clara let her, which meant the girl was being diplomatic, which she did sometimes, and it was always slightly unnerving when it happened. The results arrived Tuesday afternoon. Dr. Vance called at 3:17 p.m. and used the word conclusive in the particular careful tone that medical professionals use when they are delivering information that is factually simple and humanly enormous. Evelyn was sitting at her desk on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Tower, and she listened to the doctor's voice and looked out at the gray November skyline and felt something inside her go very still. She thanked Dr. Vance. She set the phone down on the desk. She sat without moving for a while. Ryan Cole was Clara's biological father. The math of it wasn't complicated. 7 years ago, she had been 23 and Ryan had been 30, and they had spent 3 months existing inside a kind of intensity that she had never been able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't been inside it. It had happened during a period when her family's company was on the edge of real collapse. Not a managed decline, but a genuine freefall. And her father had been unreachable in the particular way that powerful men became unreachable when they'd run out of answers. She had been in D.C. trying to negotiate with a defense contractor about a contract that Sterling Industries desperately needed, and Ryan had been something she wasn't supposed to ask too much about. Military. That was all she'd had for a long time. Military and present in a way that the men she'd grown up around had never quite managed. She had not planned any of it. That was the thing she'd had to make peace with eventually. That she had not been reckless. She had simply been 23 and exhausted and in the company of someone who made her feel like herself rather than a function. And then he was gone, deployed, and she was back in New York managing a crisis that never seemed to end. And 2 months later, she sat in a doctor's office off Fifth Avenue and was told that she was going to have a child. She had tried to reach him. That was the thing she had always held on to. She had tried. She had contacted his unit's administrative liaison. She had written 2 letters to the address he'd given her. She had called a number that rang 11 times without answer and never connected to a voicemail. And then her father had sat across from her in his office and told her, in the blunt way that Harold Sterling did everything, that Ryan Cole's unit had been reported missing, that there was no confirmation of anything, but that in his assessment, the assessment of a man who had spent 30 years building relationships with people in positions of authority, the likelihood of Ryan coming home was not something she should be planning her life around. She had believed him. She had believed him because he was her father, and because grief had a way of making you want someone to tell you what to do next, and because the alternative, that she would have to hold all of it alone, the pregnancy and the company and the absence, was too heavy to look at directly. Clara had been born in July. She was 17 inches long and had a full head of dark hair and a small crescent mark beneath her right eye that the delivery nurse called adorable, and that Evelyn had touched with one finger in the first quiet hour, in the particular way you touch something you don't yet understand. She had named her Clara because it meant clear and bright, and she had needed, in those early months, to believe that something in her life still was. Now she was sitting on the 42nd floor in November, and the man she had spent 7 years grieving in private, The kind of grieving you do when you're not allowed to say you're grieving, when the official story is that he was a brief relationship that didn't work out, and you had moved forward, which was what powerful women were supposed to do. That man had been standing 30 feet away from her 2 nights ago with their daughter's eyes and their daughter's mark on his face. And he had looked at Clara the way you looked at something you recognized in your bones before your brain had time to catch up. Evelyn pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum and breathed out slowly through her nose. Then she picked up her phone and called Marcus. "I need everything you can find on Orion Cole," she said. "Former military, Navy. He was working security at the Waldorf event Saturday night. Whatever you can pull in the next 4 hours." Marcus, to his credit, simply said, 4 hours. Yes. She stared at the skyline. The results sat in her phone as a PDF she hadn't opened again after the first read. And she thought about Clara twirling pasta at the kitchen table and saying, "He looks like he'd be good at it." And something in Evelyn that she had very carefully maintained for a very long time began, in the privacy of her own chest, to crack. Ryan's apartment was in Sunnyside, Queens, which was about as far from the Waldorf Astoria in terms of atmosphere as you could get, while still technically being in the same city. The building was a 6-story walk-up from the 1960s with a superintendent named Bert, who fixed things slowly but fixed them eventually, and a radiator in the bedroom that made a sound at 2 a.m. that Ryan had stopped noticing about 8 months in. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen that faced a brick wall, and a living room where Eli had constructed an elaborate ongoing civilization out of Lego that Ryan had learned to navigate in the dark without destroying anything critical. Eli Garcia was 8 years old and had his father's name and his mother's eyes, and a laugh that was too big for his body, the kind of laugh that made strangers turn and smile without knowing why. His parents, Marco and Daniela Garcia, had been killed in a car accident 18 months earlier on a rainy stretch of highway in Maryland. Marco had been Ryan's closest friend from his SEAL days. They'd gone through the worst of it together and come out the other side. And Marco had eventually left the service, met Daniela, and built the exact kind of ordinary life that Ryan had always been slightly envious of without admitting it. When the accident happened, Eli had been in the car too, strapped into the back seat, and he had walked away from it with a broken collarbone and a silence that lasted for 3 weeks, and then cracked open one evening when Ryan was reading to him, and Eli simply started crying and couldn't stop for a long time. Ryan had become his legal guardian because Marco's will said so, and because the alternative was unthinkable, and because Ryan had looked at this kid in the hospital and felt the specific weight of a promise that didn't need words. He had moved from his place in Brooklyn to Sunnyside because Eli's school was there, and because Marco and Daniela's old apartment was 2 blocks away. And Ms. Garcia, Daniela's mother, lived in the building and still made dinner for Eli on Thursdays, and held the boy's face in her hands sometimes in a way that Ryan always found a reason to step out of the room for. He was washing dishes when his phone rang Sunday evening, the night after the gala, and he looked at the number and didn't recognize it, which meant he almost didn't answer. He almost let it go to voicemail and turned back to the dishes and the sports radio that Eli had put on from the couch, because Eli liked the sound of people talking even when he wasn't listening to what they said. He answered it. "This is Ryan Cole." Silence for half a second, then, "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." He recognized her voice before his mind had time to process the recognition. It hit him somewhere lower than thought, some part of him that had apparently stored it for 7 years with more fidelity than he'd realized. He turned off the faucet, stood with one wet hand against the edge of the sink. "Evelyn, you knew it was me." "Yes." Another beat of silence. He could hear her breathing, steady, controlled, the breathing of someone who had practiced composure for so long it had become a second nature and was still, even now, just barely holding. "I need to talk to you," she said. "I know." "Not on the phone." He looked toward the living room, where Eli was stretched out on the carpet in front of the television, still in his soccer cleats because Ryan had reminded him twice to take them off, and apparently twice wasn't enough. The boy's sock foot was bouncing slightly to something only he could hear. "Tomorrow morning," Ryan said. "I'll come to you or you pick somewhere. There's a coffee shop on West 67th, Brennan's, 8 a.m. I'll be there." He ended the call, stood there for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he said, without moving from the kitchen, "Eli, cleats." From the living room, I know." I can still see your feet from here. The sound of Velcro tearing loose. Ryan turned the faucet back on and finished the dishes and didn't sleep much that night, which was not unusual for him but was, that particular night, worse than usual. He lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and let himself, for the first time since Saturday, think about Clara. He had seen a lot of things in his life that left marks. Some of them were the kind you could point to, like the scar along his jaw from a mission in the Horn of Africa that had gone sideways in about 17 different ways simultaneously, or the shoulder that ached in cold weather from a fall that he'd never had properly looked at because there hadn't been time, and then later there hadn't been a reason. Some of the marks were the kind you couldn't point to. Ryan had a reasonable understanding of those too, but he had not been prepared for the feeling of looking across a ballroom at a small child and having his entire understanding of the past 7 years of his life begin to reorganize itself around a single new fact. She had his eyes. She had his mark. She had his way of standing absolutely still and watching things. He'd clocked that in the 30 seconds he'd had to look at her before Evelyn moved her away. Clara Sterling was 6 years old, and the math between that and the summer 7 years ago was simple enough that Ryan, who was not a man who flinched from difficult math, had done it in about 4 seconds on Saturday night and had spent the rest of the gala doing what he always did with things that threatened to take him apart, which was to put them in a room in his head and close the door until he was somewhere private enough to open it. He was somewhere private enough now. He opened it. The thought he'd been avoiding since Saturday came through clean and clear and brutal. If Clara was his, and everything he'd seen suggested she was, then Evelyn had raised her alone. And if Evelyn had raised her alone, there were only two possible explanations. Either Evelyn had known Ryan was alive and had chosen not to tell him, or Evelyn hadn't known, or had been made to believe something that wasn't true. He didn't know which one it was yet. He would know tomorrow. He would sit across from Evelyn Sterling in a coffee shop on West 67th Street, and he would find out, and then he would decide what to do with it. And whatever he decided would be the most consequential decision he had made since the day he drove to Maryland and told Eli that he was coming home with him and that Ryan was going to be there, and that was not going to change. He thought about what Evelyn's face had looked like at the gala when she'd finally looked at him. He'd been watching, and he'd seen the exact moment the recognition hit her. Not just of him, but of the implications, of all the things that his being alive and standing in that room meant for the story she'd been living inside. It wasn't anger he'd seen. It wasn't guilt. It was something rawer and less resolved than either. He'd seen that look before, in different circumstances. It was the look of someone who had accepted a version of events as true because they needed it to be, and was now watching that version come apart. He was familiar with that feeling. He'd worn it himself on a different night in a different city, when he'd finally accepted that the woman he'd left in New York, with a promise he intended to keep, had not, as far as he could tell, left any equivalent promise for him to return to. They had both, it seemed, been wrong about each other. The question that kept him awake was not whether he could forgive her for it. That question wasn't even the right shape. The question was what had actually happened, and who had made it happen, and whether the damage it had done to Clara could be addressed, or whether it was the kind of damage that just became part of a person's structure and held their weight forever after. He fell asleep somewhere around 3 a.m. and dreamed about nothing he could remember in the morning. Brennan's was a small coffee shop with wooden booths and a counter that had probably been there since before anyone currently working in the building was born. It smelled like coffee and old wood and the particular kind of breakfast that required actual butter, which Ryan appreciated. He arrived 7 minutes early, ordered a black coffee, and sat in the booth farthest from the window. Evelyn arrived at 8:01. She was wearing a dark coat and no makeup beyond whatever was so minimal he couldn't identify it, and her hair was down rather than up, which made her look— He didn't finish the thought. She saw him immediately, came directly to the booth, sat down across from him, and placed her phone face down on the table between them like she was establishing a rule. The waitress appeared. Evelyn ordered coffee without looking at the menu. They looked at each other for a moment in the particular way of two people who had a great deal to say and were each waiting to see who would make the first move. Ryan decided he wasn't going to be polite about it. "She's mine," he said. Not a question. Evelyn's jaw tightened slightly. "The test results came back yesterday." "I didn't need a test." "I know." She looked down at the table, then back up. Her eyes were steady. "Neither did I. Not really, but I needed the paper." "Because you're thorough." Because I needed to be sure before I... She stopped, rearranged something in herself. Because I needed to be sure. Ryan wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. Tell me what happened, from your side. You tell me yours first. He looked at her. She held the look without flinching. 7 years of running a company had given her a stillness that she hadn't had when she was 23. She'd been controlled then, but brittle in ways that she probably hadn't known were visible. Now she was something more solid. Still brittle somewhere underneath, he suspected. Just better at not showing where. My side, he said. My mission got compromised. We went in with bad intelligence and 3 of my team were injured in the first 48 hours. We went dark for 11 weeks. No communication, no contact, no way in or out. When we came back stateside, I was medically grounded for 4 months. He paused. Turned the mug slightly on the table. I tried to reach you, 3 times. The contact information I had for you went to a number that rang and rang. I wrote 2 letters to the address you'd given me in D.C. No response. I had a buddy try to find a public contact for a Evelyn Hartwell in New York, and what he found was that you'd gone back to using Sterling, and that you were running a company, and that you'd had a child. She was very still. I assumed, Ryan said carefully, that you had moved on, that, given everything, you had made a choice and the choice made sense, and I had no standing to argue with it. He stopped. I was wrong about that. I tried to reach you, Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet and flat in the way of someone keeping it level by effort. Twice. The contact your unit's liaison gave me was a general administrative line that apparently went nowhere for months. My father told me your unit had been reported missing. He told me that the probability... She pressed her lips together. He presented it as fact, essentially. He told me you weren't coming back. Ryan was quiet for a moment. When Clara was born. July. And you believed him. He's my father. Something moved across her face. He was wrong about a lot of things. That one I... She picked up her coffee, set it back down without drinking. Yes, I believed him. Ryan looked at the table. He was processing something, running the numbers of it. 11 weeks dark plus 4 months grounded, and if Harold Sterling had moved fast, which Harold Sterling apparently had, the window where Ryan's return might have changed anything had been very narrow. A narrow window that someone had been careful to keep shut. Your father, Ryan said. Did he know I was alive? Evelyn's face changed in a small but specific way that told him she'd already been thinking about this. I don't know, she said. I've been asking myself that since Saturday. What's your gut tell you? She was quiet for a moment, long enough that the waitress came and refilled Ryan's coffee without either of them acknowledging it. My gut, Evelyn said, tells me that my father is a man who manages situations, and that a Navy SEAL with access to people and information that he didn't control would have looked to my father like a situation that needed managing. Ryan nodded slowly. I want to see her, he said. The sentence sat there between them. Evelyn looked at him. He could see the calculation happening. Not cold, not strategic in the way he might have expected from a CEO in a booth at 8 a.m. Real and difficult. The kind of math you did when you were trying to protect something you loved and also trying not to be the wrong kind of person. She already knows something is different, Evelyn said. She told me you looked like you'd be good at having a family. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Something that was not quite pain and not quite anything else moved through his chest. That sounds like a kid who's been watching the door, he said. Evelyn's breath hitched, just slightly, just enough for him to catch it. She's never asked about her father, Evelyn said quietly. She has, twice, asked about where fathers come from in general, in an academic way, like she was researching a topic rather than asking about herself. She looked at her coffee. She's very careful about not asking for things she thinks she won't get. Where does she get that from? The question came out before Ryan could decide whether it was too much. He watched Evelyn absorb it, watched her decide whether to be offended by it, watched her decide not to be. Me, she said. She gets it from me. Ryan picked up his coffee and drank. Outside the window, West 67th was doing its morning business. Delivery trucks and dog walkers, and a woman pushing a stroller while talking into her phone with the volume of someone who had decided the sidewalk was her living room. New York, in November. The city he'd come back to after everything, and stayed in partly because leaving again had required a kind of decisiveness he hadn't been able to muster. "I'm not here for money," he said, "or recognition, or whatever you're probably calculating on that end of the table. I raised Eli because Marco was my brother, and Eli was his son, and there was no version of that situation where I wasn't the answer. I understand parenting under circumstances that aren't clean. That's not what I'm asking for." "Then what are you asking for?" "I want Clara to know that I didn't leave her." His voice stayed even. He worked to keep it that way. "She's 6 years old, and somewhere in her she already knows something is incomplete about her story. Kids know. They don't have the words, but they know. And I am not going to be the reason she spends the next 30 years believing that her father saw her and walked away." Evelyn was looking at him with an expression he couldn't fully decode. Not quite grief, and not quite relief, and not quite the controlled boardroom face she'd been wearing since she sat down. "My father," she said slowly, "is going to push back. If you're in Clara's life, it destabilizes certain—" "I'm not asking for your father's permission. I know that. I'm telling you what you'll be walking into." Ryan looked at her. "Evelyn, I've walked into worse." She almost smiled. It didn't quite make it, but he saw the motion of it, the muscle memory of something that had once come more easily to her. "I'll need time to prepare her," Evelyn said. "She's a child. I'm not going to put her in a room with a stranger and tell her, 'Here's your father.' She needs—" "I know. However you need to do it." He set the mug down. "I'm not here to blow your life up. I'm not in the business of that. But I need you to understand that I will be her father, and the manner and pace and shape of that is something we can figure out together or separately, but the fact of it isn't something I'm going to negotiate." Evelyn studied him for a long moment. "You were always direct," she said. "I'd forgotten that. Does it bother you?" "No." She picked up her coffee. "It's one of about 4 things I didn't manage to talk myself into misremembering." Ryan looked out the window. A man in a heavy coat was arguing with a parking meter. The city moved around him with its usual indifference. He thought about the nights when Eli had bad dreams and came into Ryan's room and curled up on the other side of the bed without asking, just needing the presence of another person who knew his name. He thought about reading to the boy until he fell back asleep, and then lying awake in the dark himself, and the specific texture of that particular aloneness. Not bad exactly, just real. The reality of being the only adult in the room for someone who needed you. Evelyn had been doing that alone for 6 years. With a child who quietly watched doors and asked academic questions about where fathers came from, and had spent Saturday night in a ballroom looking at a stranger and seeing something that shouldn't have been possible and deciding, apparently, that she was not afraid of it. "She's not scared of things," Ryan said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Evelyn said. "She never has been." A beat. "It worries me sometimes." "It shouldn't." He looked back at her. "It means she trusts her own judgment. That's worth protecting." Evelyn held his gaze. Then she reached into the inside pocket of her coat and slid a card across the table, plain white, just a phone number in small print. "That's my direct line," she said. "Not through Marcus. You call that number, I pick up." Ryan took the card, looked at it, slid it into his jacket pocket. "And Evelyn." He waited until she looked at him. "Your father. Whatever he did, whatever the full shape of it turns out to be, I need you to understand that's a conversation we're going to have eventually. Not now, but eventually." She held the look for a moment. Something behind her eyes moved in the complicated way of a person who already knows something they haven't finished deciding how to say. "I know," she said. She gathered her coat. He watched her stand, watched her lift her chin slightly the way she did when she was preparing to walk back out into her own life, which was a life he still knew almost nothing about, and yet which had been running in parallel to his, in the same city, in some of the same circles, in the same world, for 7 years without either of them knowing. She was almost at the door when he said her name. She stopped, turned. "She told me to take care of you," Ryan said, before she'd said 6 words to me. Evelyn's face did something brief and complicated. "She would," she said. And then she was out the door and back on 67th Street, and Ryan sat alone in the booth with his cooling coffee and the card in his pocket, and the feeling of someone who has finally, after a very long time, stopped walking in the wrong direction. The card sat in Ryan's jacket pocket for 3 days before Evelyn used the equivalent of hers. He had not called. He told himself it was because he was giving her space to do what she'd said she needed to do. Prepare Clara, work through the logistics of introducing a stranger who wasn't a stranger into a 6-year-old's carefully maintained world. He told himself that patience was the right move here, that he'd waited 7 years and a few more days wouldn't break anything that wasn't already broken. The truth was that he needed the 3 days himself. He needed to sit with what he now knew and let it settle into something he could carry without it affecting how he showed up for Eli, who had a math test on Wednesday and a soccer scrimmage on Thursday, and who had noticed, with the particular antenna of a child who had lost too much too early, that Ryan was somewhere else in his head. "You okay?" Eli had asked Wednesday night, leaning against the kitchen doorframe in his pajamas while Ryan stared at a pot of water waiting for it to boil. "Yeah, just tired." Eli had studied him for a moment with his father's eyes. "You get that face sometimes?" "What face?" "The one where you're thinking about something you're not going to tell me about." Ryan had looked at the boy, 8 years old and already fluent in the specific language of adults who were managing something just out of reach. He hated that Eli knew that language. He hated that Marco's kid had needed to learn it. "I'm fine," Ryan said. "Go brush your teeth." Eli had gone, but the look he'd left behind stayed in the kitchen for a while. Evelyn called Thursday at 6 p.m. Ryan was in the parking lot of the soccer field, watching Eli chase a ball with the full-body commitment of a kid who had decided that gravity was merely a suggestion. "I found something," she said, without preamble, which told him it was bad. "How bad?" "I don't know yet. That's the problem." A pause. He could hear her moving, heels on hard floor, a door closing. She was somewhere private. "I've been going through my father's old files, the ones he moved to Sterling Industries archive 6 years ago when he stepped back from daily operations. I had access codes. He doesn't know I've looked. And? There's a contractor, a company called Meridian Consulting Group. They were listed as a defense-adjacent services firm that Sterling Industries used for international market assessment from approximately 9 to 12 years ago. Her voice was controlled in the way of someone reading from notes, but also processing what the notes meant in real time. "Ryan, their listed operational contacts include 2 names that were on the government intelligence roster for the region where your mission was compromised." Ryan was very still. Around him, the soccer field continued its ordinary Thursday evening business. Parents in camp chairs. A coach blowing a whistle. Eli's laugh carrying across the grass. "Say that again," Ryan said quietly. Meridian had people who were connected to the intelligence network in the same theater where your unit went dark. Her voice dropped slightly. "My father wasn't just a businessman who wanted to separate us because he didn't like your background. He had a business relationship, a financial relationship, with people who were operating in the same space where your mission failed." Ryan said nothing for a long moment. "Are you sure about the timeline, Tita?" he said. "The contracts overlap." "I'm sure." "That's not enough to prove anything." "I know that." Impatience in her voice, not at him, but at the situation. "I'm not trying to build a legal case tonight. I'm telling you what I found because you said we were going to have this conversation eventually, and I decided eventually is now because I don't—" She stopped. He heard her breathe. "I don't want to sit on this alone." He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. Eli was winning a foot race against a kid twice his size, and the look on his face was uncomplicated joy. The kind of joy that 8-year-olds who'd had bad years grabbed onto with both hands when they found it. "Evelyn, I need you to stop looking through those files for now." "Ryan, not because I don't want to know, because if there's something in there that someone doesn't want found, and you go pulling at threads, you will draw attention. You understand me? Don't touch anything else. Screenshot what you have, put it somewhere that isn't connected to your company servers, and wait." Silence. "You think there's still a risk," she said. "I think your father had relationships with people who played in dangerous spaces, and if those people are still operational in any capacity, they will notice if someone starts going through old files looking for their names." He kept his voice level. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "Yes." A beat. "I'm not naive, Ryan. I know you're not. I'm being careful." Another silence. This one different. The kind that had weight in it, that meant something was being decided. "There's more," she said. He waited. "One of the internal memos, dated about 3 weeks before your mission date, references a request to the Meridian contacts about what they describe as a personnel situation. The memo is partially redacted. I think my father redacted it himself before archiving it because the redactions are inconsistent with the rest of the document's formatting. She paused. The parts that aren't redacted reference the name of your SEAL unit's operational designation, and they reference the word extraction in a context that does not mean rescue. Ryan was quiet for a long time. Eli scored. The coach's whistle went. The other parents clapped. Normal Thursday evening in Queens. Ryan, I heard you. Someone wanted you out of the picture, she said, and my father knew. Your father, Ryan said carefully, may have wanted me gone from your life and been willing to use the connection he had to make that happen. That's different from ordering, from wanting anything worse than that. He said it not to protect Harold Sterling, but because he believed in being precise about what he could actually prove versus what the worst version of the story suggested. He had learned, in the military, that the worst version of a story was often true, but that acting on the worst version before you had evidence had a way of creating new disasters to sit on top of the original one. You're being very measured about the possibility that someone deliberately compromised your mission, Evelyn said. I'm being measured because measured is what works. He rubbed the back of his neck. And because I've had 7 years to be angry about it without knowing what I was actually angry at. I'm not going to burn that down on a partially redacted memo. I need the full picture. How do we get the full picture? I know people, he said. People who know how to find things without leaving tracks. I'll make some calls. And in the meantime? In the meantime, he watched Eli jogging toward him from the field, face flushed, cleats muddy, wearing the wide grin of a kid who'd had a good hour. In the meantime, we act like none of this happened. You go to work. You do your day. You don't change anything in how you interact with your father. He's coming to dinner Sunday, she said, with a flatness that told him exactly how that prospect sat with her. Good. Be normal. I'm going to have to sit across a table from him and… Evelyn. His voice was quiet but direct. You have sat across tables from people who are trying to take your company, your money, and your credibility, and you have done it without blinking. You can do Sunday dinner. A pause. Then, very dry. That's either the most practical pep talk I've ever received or the least comforting. Which one's working better? The practical one, she admitted. Unfortunately. Eli arrived at the fence that separated the field from the parking lot and grabbed the top rail and hung off it, breathing hard, looking at Ryan with the specific expression of a kid who wanted to tell someone about the goal he'd just scored and also wanted food immediately. I gotta go, Ryan said. I know, Ryan. She stopped. Yeah. I want to arrange the first meeting with Clara this weekend, if you're available. Somewhere neutral, nothing formal. I was thinking the Natural History Museum. She's been asking to go for 2 weeks, and she doesn't associate it with anything heavy. Something in Ryan's chest did a slow, complicated thing. Saturday, he said. I'll bring Eli. You'll bring… A brief pause of recalibration. Right, Eli. Yes, that might actually be easier, having another child there. He's a good kid. He'll roll with it. Okay. Another beat. Saturday. Saturday, he confirmed. He ended the call. Eli was looking at him with 9/10 of his attention and 1/10 on a snack bar wrapper he'd found in his jacket pocket. Who was that? Eli asked. Someone from work, Ryan said, which was technically not true and technically not a lie, and was the kind of answer you gave when the real answer was going to require a longer conversation than a Thursday parking lot. Eli accepted this with the pragmatism of a child who had learned that adults sometimes had separate lives running parallel to the one he could see. Can we get pizza? Yeah, Ryan said. We can get pizza. The Natural History Museum on a Saturday in November was busy enough to provide cover and open enough not to feel like a trap. Evelyn had thought through the logistics with the kind of precision she brought to board presentations, which Ryan noticed and didn't comment on because he understood it. When you couldn't control the emotional content of a situation, you controlled the logistics, and at least the logistics gave you something to do with your hands. They met at the main entrance at 10. Evelyn and Clara arrived first. Ryan saw them from across the wide steps. Clara in a red jacket, her hair down today with a knit hat pulled over it, holding Evelyn's hand with the loose grip of a child who was connected but not dependent. Evelyn was in dark jeans and a coat, hair back, and she looked, without the armor of the gala or the tension of the coffee shop, like someone who was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Ryan and Eli came up the steps side by side. Eli had been told the basics. They were meeting a woman Ryan knew from a long time ago and her daughter, who was 6, which Eli had received with a shrug that communicated simultaneous indifference and mild curiosity, which was Eli's factory setting for most new information. Clara saw them first. She stopped on the top step, which appeared to be something she did. This stopping, this deliberate stillness in the middle of movement. Her eyes found Ryan's face, and she looked at him with the direct, unafraid assessment that Evelyn had described and that he had glimpsed across the ballroom, and she did not look away. Ryan stopped one step below her, eye level, roughly. "Hi," he said. "Hi," Clara said. "I'm Ryan. Ryan. I know." She tilted her head slightly. "You have the same thing I have." She touched the spot beneath her right eye with one small finger. "Yeah," he said, "I do." She considered this. Then she looked at Eli, who was standing at Ryan's shoulder with his hands in his pockets. "Who are you?" she asked. "Eli," Eli said. "I'm 8. I'm 6. "Cool." Clara seemed to find this an acceptable exchange. She looked back at Ryan one more time, then turned to her mother. "Can we go see the blue whale?" "Yes," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes, briefly, met Ryan's over Clara's head, and she looked like someone who had been holding their breath for 4 days and wasn't entirely sure they were allowed to stop yet. They went to see the blue whale. The morning moved the way. Mornings sometimes did when you were paying attention to something that mattered, slowly in the good moments, too fast in the ones you wanted to keep. The blue whale hung above them in the ocean hall in its enormous, improbable way, and Clara stood beneath it with her head tilted all the way back and said it was the size of a building, and Eli told her that actually it was about the size of 2 school buses end to end, and Clara told him that was the same as a building, and Eli considered this and said fair point, and Ryan watched the two of them and felt something quietly enormous shift somewhere inside his chest. Evelyn stood beside him, not close, but close enough that they were clearly together in the way of adults managing a shared situation. She had a coffee from a cart near the entrance. She was watching Clara with the particular vigilance of a mother who was trying to look like she wasn't watching. "She hasn't asked you anything yet," Ryan said quietly. "She will." Evelyn turned the cup in her hands. "She's gathering information first. She always does." "Smart kid." "Dangerous kid," Evelyn said, but she said it the way you said things about people you were proud of even when they made your life complicated. The question came 40 minutes later, in the Hall of Human Origins, which Ryan privately thought was an appropriate setting. Clara had separated slightly from Eli, who was reading an exhibit placard with the focused interest of a kid who actually liked reading, and she came to stand beside Ryan in front of a display case. She didn't look at the display. She looked at Ryan. "Did you know about me before?" she asked. "Before the party?" Ryan crouched down so he was at her level. He had thought about this question. He had thought about several versions of it and several answers, and he had decided that the only approach that would work with this particular child was the undecorated truth, delivered simply. "No," he said. "I didn't know you existed. If I had, I would have come a long time ago." Clara held his gaze with the steady brown eyes that were so much like his own that it still caught him sideways every time. "Why didn't you know?" she asked. "Because some people made some mistakes," he said. "Grown-up mistakes. And those mistakes kept us from finding each other until now." She processed this. Her brow folded in the thinking way Evelyn had described. "Were you sad?" she asked. "When you didn't know?" Ryan held the question for a moment. "I was missing something," he said. "I didn't know what it was, but something was missing." Clara appeared to find this answer acceptable in a way that the more elaborate version might not have been. She looked back at the display case. Then she said, almost casually, the way children delivered the things that cost them the most, "I used to think maybe you just didn't want to come." Ryan felt that sentence in every part of him. "Clara." He waited until she looked at him. That was never it, not for a single second. "Do you understand?" She studied his face. The crescent mark beneath her eye matched the one beneath his exactly, small and pale in the museum's soft light. She was looking at him the way she'd looked at him across the ballroom. Not with fear, not with desperate hope, but with the careful evaluation of someone who had learned not to assume. "Okay," she said finally. It was small and simple and absolutely not casual, and Ryan recognized it for what it was. A child choosing, provisionally, to believe something she wanted to be true. "Okay," he said back. She returned to Eli. He straightened up. Evelyn was standing 4 feet away, and her expression was the kind that had nothing left to defend itself with. "You did well," she said quietly. "She made it easy." He looked at Clara, who was now trying to drag Eli away from his placard. She already knew what she wanted to know. She just needed permission to believe the answer. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then, "My father called last night." Ryan looked at her. He wanted to know if I'd heard anything about the Meridian files. Apparently their name came up in a federal contractor audit. He was casual about it. Harold is always casual about things that terrify him. She kept her voice very low. He asked if I'd been in the archive recently. "What did you say?" I said no. She looked at him steadily. "I lied to my father's face on the phone and felt nothing, which tells me something about where I am with this." "What did he say?" "He said good. He said there were some old vendor relationships that he'd rather not have complicated by people with no context digging around in old records." She turned the coffee cup again. "That's Harold for, there are things in there that will destroy me if they come out." Ryan said nothing for a moment. He was running the geometry of it. Harold Sterling's phone call, the federal audit of Meridian's contracting history, the timing of all of it landing in the same week that Ryan Cole had shown up at a charity gala and been recognized by a 6-year-old girl. "Someone else is pulling at the Meridian thread," he said. "And it's not just a contractor audit." Evelyn looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" "A federal audit doesn't make Harold Sterling call his daughter to ask if she's been in the archive. A federal audit makes him call his lawyers." Ryan kept his voice low. "Someone reached out to him. Someone who knows there's a connection between Meridian and your family and who is using that connection as leverage." "Leverage for what?" "That's what I don't know yet." He looked across the hall at Clara and Eli, who had found a touchscreen exhibit and were now arguing companionably about who got to press the buttons. "But I think we're about to find out." The threat materialized 4 days later, and it was worse than either of them had constructed in those careful, quiet conversations at the edges of ordinary life. Ryan had reached out, through channels that required no digital footprint, to 2 men he'd trusted since the worst nights of his military career. Men who still had access to certain corners of information that existed between what was officially known and what was simply true. What came back to him was a picture that took him an evening to fully assemble and another evening to fully accept. Meridian Consulting Group had not dissolved when Sterling Industries ended its contracts with them. They had restructured, moved money through a series of shell arrangements, and continued operating under different names with different clients. 2 of their principals were still active. One of them, a man named Victor Hale, who had no public presence and a very detailed private record, had acquired over the past several years a significant position of influence within Sterling Industries itself. Not as an executive, not under his own name, but through a senior vice president named Douglas Crane, who had been Harold Sterling's protege and who had, over Evelyn's tenure as CEO, been systematically bypassed in his bids for greater operational control. Douglas Crane, who had reason to be angry at Harold Sterling for failing to hand him the company he'd been promised. Douglas Crane, who had reason to be angry at Evelyn Sterling for building something she hadn't inherited but had earned. Douglas Crane, who had a connection to Victor Hale that went back 12 years, and who had, according to the information Ryan's contacts had assembled, recently met with Hale 3 times in private locations. Ryan sat at his kitchen table at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday with the information spread in front of him and a cold cup of coffee and the sound of Eli breathing in the next room, and he thought about the architecture of it. Hale had something on Harold. Harold knew it. Hale wanted Sterling Industries. Not the money exactly, but the access, the contracts, the defense-adjacent relationships that a company like Sterling provided to someone who knew how to exploit them. And the cleanest path to that access ran through Evelyn. The question was how. The answer, when Ryan finally worked his way to it, was so simple that it made him go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Clara. A custody dispute. A scandal. A revelation that Sterling Industries CEO had concealed the identity of her child's biological father, a former military operator with a classified service record, while building a public persona of impeccable professional integrity. In the wrong hands, shaped the right way, with the right pressure applied at the right moment, it could trigger a board crisis. And in the chaos of a board crisis, a man with the right relationships and the right prepared moves could step into the space that opened up. They weren't going to hurt Clara. They were going to use her, use the existence of Ryan, use the story of what Harold had done, use the gap between Evelyn's public image and the complicated private truth, and they were going to time it for maximum damage, unless Ryan moved first. He called Evelyn at 11:23 p.m. She answered on the second ring, which told him she hadn't been asleep. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you react." A pause. "That's never a good opening." "No," he agreed. "It's not," he told her. He told her carefully and completely, in the order that made the clearest picture, and he listened to her silence on the other end of the line change quality as the full shape of it became clear. She did not interrupt. She asked two precise questions when he finished, about the documentation of the Crane-Hale connection and about the specific timeline Hale needed to execute. And both questions were the right questions, which confirmed what he already understood about her. She thought clearly under pressure, possibly better under pressure than without it. "Douglas Crane," she said. The words came out flat and cold. "You know him." "I have known Douglas Crane for 8 years." She paused. "He sat in my office 6 weeks ago and told me I was doing a remarkable job. People who are planning to destroy you usually do." She was quiet for a moment. "He has access," she said. "He's senior enough to have access to things that... He could have known you were coming to the gala. The security staffing goes through a vendor that he oversees." Ryan had already thought of this, which means he's known about us since Saturday, which means they're further along in whatever they're planning than I thought. "How much time do we have?" "Not a lot." He stood up from the table, walked to the window. The street below was quiet in the way New York was quiet at midnight. Not silent, never silent, but reduced to its most necessary sounds. "Evelyn, I need you to do something tomorrow that is going to be very difficult." "What?" "I need you to go to your father. I need you to tell him that you know about Meridian. And I need you to do it before Hale does, because right now your father's primary concern is protecting himself. And the moment Hale makes his move, Harold Sterling will do whatever Hale needs him to do to make the exposure go away." He paused. "But if you get there first, if you're the one holding the evidence and making the offer, you have a different conversation. You want me to confront my father with what we know and offer him, what, protection? I want you to offer him the chance to do the right thing before someone takes the choice away from him." Ryan kept his voice level. "And I want you to record the conversation." Another long silence. "He's going to be scared," Evelyn said finally. Not sympathetically exactly, just accurately. "Good," Ryan said. "Scared people tell the truth." "And if he doesn't?" "Then we go a different route. But I think he will." Ryan thought about Harold Sterling, a man he'd never met, who had done something monstrous to him through careful distance and plausible deniability and the particular cowardice of powerful people who outsource the consequences of their choices. He thought about what Evelyn had said. He manages situations. He's a man who's always had an exit. Give him one that's better than the alternative, and he'll take it. "And if Crane moves before I can get to my father?" "I'll be watching Clara," Ryan said. It came out simple and absolute, the way things did when they were not a decision but a fact. The silence on the other end of the line shifted in quality again, different from the others, less strategic, more human. "Ryan," her voice was quieter now, "I am not good at this." "At what?" "At needing someone." A pause. "I've been running this alone for 6 years and I know how to do that. I don't know how to do this, whatever this is." Ryan looked out at the quiet street. He thought about the coffee shop on 67th and the Natural History Museum, and Clara's face when she'd said, "I used to think maybe you just didn't want to come," and the particular way Evelyn had looked when she didn't have a room full of people to perform competence for. "You're not running it alone anymore," he said. "That's all this is." He heard her breathe. Okay, she said, in the same small, undecorated way that Clara had said it in the museum. Like mother, like daughter. A provisional choice to believe something that might be true. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. He ended the call and stood at the window for a while. The radiator in the bedroom knocked twice and went quiet. Somewhere on the street below, a cab moved through the intersection with its light on, searching. Ryan thought about Douglas Crane sitting in Evelyn's office 6 weeks ago, telling her she was doing a remarkable job. He thought about the specific kind of patience that required, the patience of someone who had already decided on the ending and was simply waiting for the right moment to start. I was familiar with that kind of patience. He'd used it himself, in circumstances that were considerably less comfortable than a Manhattan office. The difference was that Ryan had always used it in service of bringing people home safely. He intended to do the same thing now. Evelyn met her father for lunch the following day at a restaurant he'd been going to for 30 years, a quiet Italian place on the Upper East Side, where the owner knew his name and the corner booth was always available when Harold Sterling called ahead. It was the kind of place that Harold used for conversations he wanted to feel civilized, which was its own kind of information about what he was expecting from the afternoon. He was already seated when she arrived, which he always was. Harold Sterling had the punctuality of a man who equated arriving first with controlling the room, and in fairness to him, the strategy had worked for most of his 71 years. He was still handsome in the way of men who had been genuinely handsome when they were younger and had maintained enough of the structure to carry it forward. Silver-haired, straight-backed, wearing the dark blazer he favored for lunches that weren't quite business, but weren't quite personal either. He stood when he saw her, which he always did, and kissed her cheek, which he always did, and Evelyn performed the daughter's version of the greeting with the competence of someone who had been doing it so long that she no longer had to think about the mechanics of it. "You look tired," he said, as she settled across from him, his standard opening when he was worried about something and expressing it as concern for her. "I'm fine," she said. Standard response. The waiter came. Harold ordered what he always ordered. Evelyn ordered sparkling water and whatever the fish was. She wasn't going to eat it. Her stomach had been a closed system since the night Ryan had laid out the full architecture of what Douglas Crane and Victor Hale were building, and she'd spent the morning in a state of controlled nausea that she'd managed through the sheer force of having no alternative. She had the recording application open on her phone before she'd gotten out of the car. She'd placed the phone face down on the table between them, which Harold took as what people always took it as, the contemporary habit of keeping the device close. He didn't look twice at it. "Claire's been asking about the winter program at her school," Evelyn said. She'd decided to come at it from an angle, let the conversation find its own footing for a few minutes, because Harold was sharp, and she needed him relaxed enough to be honest, before she needed him frightened enough to cooperate. "She wants to do the science workshop. They build something, apparently. A robot, maybe." "She's too young for robotics," Harold said. "She's not, actually. They have an age-appropriate version." "How old is the teacher?" "I don't know, Dad. I didn't card her." Harold made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He picked up his water. "She's a smart child. It would be a shame to put her in something that doesn't challenge her enough." "I agree." Evelyn turned her own glass on the table. "She's been asking other things, too." Harold looked at her over the rim of his glass. The specific attentiveness that came into his eyes when a conversation moved direction was one of the things Evelyn had inherited from him, or had learned from being around him. The ability to track when the real conversation was beginning. "What kind of things?" he asked. His voice was easy. Harold's voice was always easy. "About her father." A beat. Harold set the glass down. "She's 6. Children ask—" "Not Clara." Evelyn kept her voice even. "Clara doesn't ask about things she doesn't already know the shape of. You know that. She asked because she's met someone." The shift in Harold's face was small but specific. The ease didn't disappear. He was too controlled for that. But something underneath it recalibrated, some internal gyroscope that was suddenly working harder to keep him level. "Evelyn, Ryan Cole," she said. Harold said nothing. That was its own answer. "He was working security at the Waldorf Gala last week. Clara saw him and recognized him the way a child recognizes something that belongs in her life and has been missing." Evelyn's voice stayed flat and clean, no accusation in it yet, because accusation would make him defensive and defensive. Harold was a Harold who stopped talking. She asked me why he looked like her. Harold's hands were on the table. They didn't move, which for another man might have been calm, but for Harold, who was someone who gestured and adjusted and was always physically engaged in conversation, the stillness was equivalent to flinching. I had a DNA test done, Evelyn said. It came back conclusive. I know what you're going to say, Harold said. His voice had changed. Not much, but enough. The ease was doing different work now. It was covering something rather than expressing something. I don't think you do, Evelyn said, because what I'm going to say isn't what you're expecting. She reached into her bag. The folder she placed on the table between them was thin, 8 pages, selected from what she and Ryan had assembled, chosen specifically for maximum clarity with minimum room for reinterpretation. She slid it toward him. He looked at it without touching it. Then he looked at her. Open it, she said. He opened it. She watched his face as he read. Harold Sterling had spent 50 years becoming unreadable, and he was very good at it, but she had spent 30 years watching him, and she knew the vocabulary of his small tells. The slight increase in the pressure of his jaw, the way his left hand, below the table, had found the edge of his chair. He closed the folder after 4 pages. He'd seen enough to know what the rest would say. How long have you had this? He asked. Long enough. She put the folder back in her bag. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need you to answer it honestly. Not as Sterling Industries' former chairman, not as my father in the way you think of that role. As the person who made a decision 7 years ago that affected 3 people's lives. Were you aware that Ryan Cole was alive? The silence stretched for several seconds. A waiter moved past their table without stopping. Somewhere near the front of the restaurant, someone laughed at something. I was informed, Harold said slowly, after the fact, that his unit had returned stateside. After Clara was born. 2 months after, yes. Evelyn breathed through her nose steadily, the way you breathed when what you felt and what you showed needed to stay separated. And you said nothing. It was complicated, Evelyn. He had a classified record, his connection to certain contractors, his name appearing in the same operational space as some of our vendor relationships. If that had come out during a period when we were already under scrutiny, it would have, you were protecting the company. I was protecting you. His voice shifted into something that was almost genuine, which was the most dangerous version of Harold. You were 23 with a newborn and a collapsing business empire and no margin for... You were protecting yourself, Evelyn said quietly. And you used me as the reason. Harold looked at her. For a moment, something behind his very controlled eyes moved in a way that looked like the thing it actually was, which was an old man looking at the specific shape of his own worst choice and knowing that his daughter was seeing it too. There's a man named Victor Hale, Evelyn said, and there's Douglas Crane, and there's a conversation between them that's been happening for several months about Sterling Industries and about Ryan Cole and about me, and about Clara. She let that land. They're not interested in protecting anyone. They're interested in leverage, and the leverage they have runs directly through you. Harold's face did something she hadn't seen on it in a long time. The controlled surface held, but beneath it, the specific quality of a man who had always had the next move available and was looking at a board where that was no longer true. What do you want? He said. The question wasn't weak exactly. It was stripped down. Harold without the performance. I want you to give Ryan a full written accounting of what you did. Everything. The intercepted contact, the information you provided about his unit's status, the decision to exclude him from Clara's records. Everything. She held his gaze. And I want you to provide whatever you have on the Meridian connection to the federal auditors who are already looking at their contracting history. Voluntarily. Before Crane and Hale can use it. If I do that, the exposure is coming regardless. The only question is whether you're the man who covered it up or the man who came forward. She paused. I'd rather have a father who made a terrible mistake than a father who made a terrible mistake and then chose it again when given the chance to choose differently. Harold was very still. Does he know you're here? He asked. Cole? He suggested it, she said, but this conversation is mine. Harold looked down at the table. He was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant continued its polite business around them, entirely indifferent. I'll need to speak with my attorneys, he said. You have 24 hours before Ryan takes what we have to people who won't wait for attorneys. That's not a lot of time. It's more than you gave him, Evelyn said. She left the restaurant without eating. The recording on her phone was 41 minutes long, and she sent the file to Ryan from the back of her car before she'd made it 2 blocks. And then she sat in the leather seat with her coat still on and stared at the city moving past the window and allowed herself, for approximately 90 seconds, to feel the full weight of what she had just done. Then she straightened up, called Marcus, and went back to work. The call from Ryan came at 7 p.m. that Friday evening, 4 days after the restaurant lunch, and 2 days after Harold Sterling had, through his attorneys, contacted the federal audit team with a voluntary disclosure that named Meridian, named Hale, and named Douglas Crane's role as an intermediary. The auditors had not been surprised. They had been, according to Ryan's contact inside that world, the kind of unsurprised that suggested they had already been moving in this direction, and Harold's disclosure had simply accelerated a process already in motion. Crane had been informed that morning that his access to Sterling Industries' systems had been revoked pending an internal investigation. He hadn't come into the office. His assistant reported that he'd said he was unwell. Ryan was in the middle of making dinner when his phone rang. Not Evelyn's direct number, but the agency line, the number tied to the security work. He almost let it go to voicemail because he had onions in the pan and Eli was setting the table, and the moment felt, in the specific way of Friday evenings with a kid who'd had a good week at school, like something worth protecting from interruption. He answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman he didn't recognize, and she identified herself as part of Evelyn Sterling's household security team. And what she said next made Ryan turn the burner off and put his hand flat on the counter. Clara was gone. Not from the Sterling apartment. From the private family gathering space on the 3rd floor of Sterling Tower. A smaller event room that the family used for low-key internal functions, no press, minimal staff. Evelyn had taken Clara there that evening for what should have been a 90-minute donor reception, small and controlled, the kind of thing Clara had attended before without incident. Security footage showed Clara following a woman in catering uniform through a service corridor at 6:23 p.m. The woman's face was partially obscured by a catering tray. The corridor led to a service elevator. After the elevator, the footage went dark, a gap of 11 minutes that did not happen by accident. "Who else knows?" Ryan said. "Ms. Sterling, myself, and the building's head of security. We haven't contacted—" "Don't contact anyone else yet." He was already moving toward the hook by the door where his jacket hung. "Where's Ms. Sterling now?" "3rd floor, the event room. She's—" A pause. "She's not— She's holding it together, but she needs— I'm on my way." He ended the call. Eli was standing in the kitchen doorway with 2 forks in his hand, reading Ryan's face with the quiet accuracy he'd developed over 18 months of living with a man who kept things calm on the surface. "I have to go," Ryan said. He was already into his jacket. "I'm going to call Ms. Garcia. You're going to her place for the night. Is someone hurt?" "Not yet." He pulled his keys off the hook, crouched briefly to Eli's eye level the way he did when he needed the boy to hear him without the noise of the room. "Everything is going to be okay. I need you to do what I say without questions right now. Can you do that?" Eli looked at him, set the forks down on the counter. "Yeah," he said, "I can do that." "Good kid." He was in the car in 4 minutes and on the Queensboro Bridge in 7. Evelyn was standing in the middle of the 3rd floor event room when Ryan arrived, and she looked like a woman who had taken everything that made her formidable and aimed it at the single task of not collapsing. The room around her was still set up for the reception, glasses on tables, flowers in the center arrangements, the casual geometry of a gathering that had been interrupted mid-breath. Staff had been moved out. 2 security people stood near the door. Marcus was in the corner with his phone, visibly trying to look useful. She turned when Ryan came through the door, and for a second he saw through everything she'd aimed at staying upright and saw what was underneath it, which was a mother whose child was missing and who was about 30 seconds from the edge of a panic that would make everything harder. He crossed the room to her directly. He didn't touch her. He stood close enough that she had to look at him and not at the empty room. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. "From the beginning. Everything." She told him. Her voice was controlled and sequential, and he listened without interrupting, watching her face for the details that the words weren't carrying. When she finished, he asked 2 questions. About the catering company contracted for the evening and about the specific corridor the footage had shown. She answered both immediately. The corridor connects to the service elevator and the loading dock, she said. Building security reviewed the dock footage and found a delivery van that left at 6:31. Did they run the plates? The plates were false. Ryan nodded. He'd expected that. He asked for the footage timestamps and the building's floor plan, and Marcus produced both on a tablet with the speed of someone who had been waiting to be given a task. Ryan studied the floor plan for 90 seconds. He studied the footage timestamps for 30. The gap in the footage is deliberate, he said. Someone cut the feed from inside the building. That's not a random catering employee. That's someone who knew the camera system. Crane had access to the building's security infrastructure, Evelyn said. Her voice tightened. He was on the committee that approved the camera installation 3 years ago. So he knew the blind spots. Ryan handed the tablet back to Marcus. The van went south from the loading dock. The waterfront is 6 blocks. If they wanted somewhere to hold her without drawing attention in the short term, somewhere they could control the access points and buy time for a conversation, he was already moving through the logic, the map in his head overlaid with years of reading urban environments for their tactical geometry. There's an abandoned warehouse facility at Pier 34, decommissioned 2 years ago, utilities still partially connected, isolated enough at night. It's the right profile. You can't know that, Evelyn said. There are dozens of— I don't know it, Ryan said, but it's where I'd go. And Crane has been planning this for a while, which means he's had time to prepare a location. Prepared locations are the kind of place you scout in advance, and a man scouting a temporary holding location in Lower Manhattan picks something accessible from the loading dock and dark after 6 p.m. He looked at her. It's where I'd start. I'm calling the police, she said. You can call them. He was already heading for the door. But they're going to take 40 minutes to organize, and Crane is going to use that time. I know where to look. I'll be faster. She was moving too. Right behind him. He stopped. Turned. Evelyn, stay here. No. I need you to coordinate from— She's my daughter. Her voice was flat and absolute and left no room for the conversation he was trying to have. You are not leaving me in this building. He looked at her for a moment. Her coat was in her hand. Her jaw was set at the angle he'd come to recognize as the one that meant the discussion was over. Fine, he said, but you do exactly what I say when I say it. No hesitation, no negotiation. Agreed. And you call the police from the car. We're not going in there without them knowing where we are. They were moving before he finished the sentence. The drive to Pier 34 took 11 minutes. Ryan drove and Evelyn made the call. Clear, specific, correct in every detail. The kind of call that got taken seriously because the person making it sounded like someone who knew what serious looked like. She gave the location, gave the name Douglas Crane, gave the time of the disappearance. The officer on the other end told her units would respond. She ended the call and put the phone in her coat pocket and did not say anything for the remaining 4 minutes of the drive. Ryan parked 2 blocks from the pier, on a side street between 2 delivery trucks that provided cover, and they moved on foot. The waterfront at this section of Lower Manhattan was the working kind. Not tourist-facing, not developed, just the bones of an industrial past that hadn't fully cleared out. The warehouse facility occupied the end of a short pier, 3 connected buildings that had once processed import goods and now processed nothing. A chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter. The gate was padlocked, but Ryan had come prepared for that, and 30 seconds with the right tool took care of it. He stopped Evelyn at the fence line. There's a vehicle parked behind the second building, he said quietly. The sedan. That's not random. They're inside. He looked at her. When we go in, you stay behind me and to my left. If I stop, you stop. If I tell you to get down, you get down without asking why. Understood? Understood, she said. No attitude, no pushback. She'd put on the version of herself that ran things under pressure and taken off the one that was Claire's mother for just long enough to get through the next few minutes. Ryan moved and she moved with him. They entered the second building through a side door that had been left unlatched. Not an oversight, he registered, but a decision, which told him they were expected, or at least that the possibility of someone following had been accounted for. The interior was large and dark, the kind of dark that city buildings achieved at night when the ambient light from outside was blocked by walls and roofing. Not total, but disorienting for eyes accustomed to the street. Ryan's were not. He'd spent enough nights in places where the dark was the operating environment that his eyes adjusted quickly and his brain reorganized itself around what sound and shape and air movement told him rather than what he could clearly see. He heard voices before his eyes had fully adjusted. Two of them, one he didn't recognize and one lower and more careful that he matched, after a moment, to the recordings Evelyn had pulled from Sterling Industries board meetings. Douglas Crane. He was talking to someone who wasn't Clara. Another adult, probably the person who had handled the extraction. Ryan tracked the voices to the far side of the building, behind a partial wall that separated the main floor from what had been a loading supervisor's station. He moved along the near wall, slow and quiet, and Evelyn stayed with him in a way that told him she was someone who could actually operate under the instruction to be silent. She wasn't shuffling or breathing loudly or bumping into things, which was not a given with civilians regardless of how composed they were. He reached the edge of the partial wall and stopped. Through a gap in the old partition, he could see into the supervisor's station. It was maybe 400 square feet, lit by two battery-powered lanterns that threw orange light across the concrete floor. Clara was sitting on a folding chair in the center of the space. She was wearing the same clothes she'd had on at the reception. She was not tied, and she was not crying, which Ryan registered as the most important information in the room, and the tension in his chest shifted from the kind that was about outcome to the kind that was about execution. The difference between not knowing whether the thing you feared had happened and knowing it hadn't, and focusing entirely on making sure it stayed that way. Clara was watching Douglas Crane the way she watched everything, with that particular unafraid stillness that Ryan had already come to understand was her primary mode of being in the world. Crane was a man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, wearing what had probably been an expensive suit that morning and was now a moderately rumpled version of that. He was talking on a phone, his back partially to Clara, his voice carrying the careful elevation of someone managing a negotiation. "She's fine," Crane was saying. "She'll stay fine as long as Evelyn—" Ryan stepped around the partition. Crane turned. The man beside him, younger, broader, someone's hired help, started to move and stopped when he looked at Ryan's face and made the assessment that people who were paying attention made about Ryan when Ryan was not attempting to look friendly. Clara looked at Ryan. "Hi," she said. "Hey, kid." He kept his eyes on Crane and the other man. "You okay?" "Yes." A pause. "He wouldn't let me call my mom." "I know. You're going to call her in a minute." Crane was doing the recalculation that men in his position did when a plan encountered a variable they hadn't planned for. His hand tightened on his phone. "You have no authority." "My daughter is in this room," Evelyn said from behind Ryan. She had come around the partition 2 steps behind him and was standing now just to his left. And whatever she felt about being in an abandoned warehouse at night was not visible on her face. Only the particular cold focus of a woman who had run out of patience for the people trying to use her life as a bargaining chip. Crane looked at her. Something moved across his face that was part calculation and part the specific expression of a man who has built an elaborate plan and is watching it fail in the very first minutes. "You should have answered my call this morning," Crane said. "If you'd listened—" "Give me my daughter," Evelyn said. She didn't move toward Clara. She looked at Crane and waited. "This isn't how this was supposed to—" "I have documentation of your meetings with Victor Hale," Evelyn said. Her voice didn't waver. "I have the communication logs connecting Meridian to your financial arrangements. I have your name in a federal disclosure that my father filed 2 days ago." She paused. "The only move you had left was this one, and it's already done. The police are on their way, so you can either let my daughter walk to me right now and take whatever comes next, or you can make this worse and take that instead." Crane looked at Ryan. Whatever he was looking for in Ryan's face, he didn't find anything that helped him. "Walk to your mom," Ryan said to Clara quietly. Clara stood up from the chair. She crossed the concrete floor without hurrying, which was somehow one of the bravest things Ryan had ever watched a 6-year-old do, and she walked directly to Evelyn. Evelyn's arms came around her and she pulled her daughter close and bent her head over Clara's, and for a moment said nothing at all. Ryan stayed where he was, positioned between Crane and the door, until the sound of sirens began to build from the direction of the street. Crane's companion sat down on the floor, which was the decision of a man who had done the math and come out on the side of cooperation. Crane himself stood where he was, phone still in his hand, looking at the lantern-lit floor of an abandoned building where a plan had ended. And he looked like a man who had spent months believing in his own architecture and was now standing in its rubble. The police came through the main door 3 minutes later. The hours that followed had the quality of events that happened after the crisis, rather than during it, longer in duration than they needed to be, full of people doing their jobs correctly and carefully, which was necessary and exhausting in equal measure. Ryan gave his account to a detective named Okafor, who took notes with the particular efficiency of someone used to untangling situations that had too many moving parts. Evelyn gave hers separately. Clara sat in the back of an ambulance with a paramedic who offered her a juice box and received the serious consideration of a child evaluating an unfamiliar beverage before accepting it. When Ryan finished with the detective and found Evelyn, she was standing outside the ambulance bay, her arms crossed over her chest, watching Clara through the open doors with the particular stillness of someone who had been running on adrenaline and was now navigating the complicated geography of what came after. He stood beside her. They watched Clara explain something to the paramedic with considerable hand gestures. She told the paramedic that she wasn't scared, Evelyn said. She said she knew someone would come. Ryan said nothing for a moment. She was right, he said. Evelyn turned to look at him. Her hair had come half loose from wherever it had been pinned, and there was a smudge of something on her coat sleeve from the warehouse, and she looked like a woman who had been through something real, which was different from how she usually looked. And he found that he preferred this version, not because she was diminished, but because she was more fully herself. She said she knew you would come, Evelyn said. Specifically. Ryan felt something move through him that he didn't try to name. She barely knows me, he said. She knows enough. Evelyn looked back at Clara. She told me in the car to the museum last week that you had the same eyes and the same mark, and that she thought that meant something. A pause. I told her it meant you were related. She said she knew that already. She meant something else. Ryan waited. She said she thought it meant you were the kind of person who came back, Evelyn said, even when things were hard. He looked at Clara, who had finished explaining something and was now examining the interior of the ambulance with the focused interest she brought to everything unfamiliar. 6 years old, sitting in the back of an ambulance at a pier in Lower Manhattan at 10 at night, curious about the equipment. She's going to be okay, he said. I know. Evelyn's voice was quiet. Because of you. Because of herself, he said. I just knew where to look. Evelyn made a small sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. Detective Okafor reappeared to tell them that Douglas Crane had been formally detained and that a federal team was already coordinating with the local investigation around the Meridian connection, and that they would need Evelyn at the precinct in the morning. She nodded, asked 2 precise questions, and arranged it. Then she went to the ambulance and helped Clara down, and Clara came with her in the way of a child who was tired but not broken, which was the best and most important thing. Clara looked at Ryan from within the circle of Evelyn's arm. You came, she said. Yeah, Ryan said, I came. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd been carrying around and could now set down. Then she leaned into her mother's side and closed her eyes, and Evelyn held her, and the 3 of them stood at the edge of a pier in Lower Manhattan, while the city did its indifferent, continuous work around them. Ryan looked at them both and thought about the 7 years in between and the series of choices and lies and distances that had made those years what they were. And he thought that there was no clean accounting for it, no way to look at what had been lost and find a satisfying sum. The years were gone. The time was not coming back. Clara had grown her first 6 years without him, and that was a fact that would always be a fact, and he was not the kind of man who made peace with facts by pretending they were something other than what they were. But he was also, and had always been, a man who understood that the only direction that mattered was forward. Later, after the paramedic signed the release, and Okafor handed Evelyn his card, and the pier began to empty of the people whose jobs had brought them there, Ryan walked with Evelyn and Clara to the car. Clara fell asleep against Evelyn's shoulder in the back seat before they'd made it 3 blocks, her breathing slow and even, the juice box from the paramedic still loosely in one small hand. Evelyn looked at her daughter's sleeping face for a moment. Then she looked at Ryan in the rear view. Thank you, she said quietly. He kept his eyes on the road. Don't. Ryan, you don't thank family, he said. That's not how it works. Silence. The kind that wasn't empty. He drove, and the city moved around them, and Clara slept. And in the quiet of a car moving through New York at night, something that had been broken for 7 years finally, imperfectly, tentatively, began to hold. The days after the warehouse had a specific texture that Ryan recognized from other difficult periods in his life. The strange flatness of time immediately following a crisis. When the body was still running on emergency chemistry, and the world had the slightly unreal quality of a place you'd return to after being somewhere else. Things that had seemed enormous before the crisis felt small. Things that had seemed small revealed themselves to be the ones that actually mattered. Clara slept for 11 hours the night they brought her home. Evelyn sat in the chair beside her bed for 3 of them before Ryan, who had come upstairs after making sure the building's security team had been properly briefed, found her there and told her quietly that she needed to sleep too. "I know," Evelyn said, without moving. "She's okay. I know that too." He pulled the other chair from Clara's desk and sat down beside her, and neither of them said anything for a while. And Clara breathed in the even, untroubled way of a child who had processed the evening by going to sleep rather than by lying awake catastrophizing, which was the child's gift and the adult's lost art. "She told me something in the warehouse," Evelyn said eventually. Her voice was low. While they were waiting, she said she wasn't scared because she was thinking about a problem. Ryan looked at her. "What problem?" She said she was working out, in her head, how the lights in the building were connected, because there were 2 lanterns and 1 power strip, and she was trying to figure out where the electricity was coming from, given that the building looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. Evelyn paused. She said it helped her not think about the part that was scary. Ryan was quiet for a moment. "Smart kid," he said. "Terrifying kid," Evelyn said, but she said it the same way she'd said it about other things. The way you described someone you were proud of when the pride was so large it came out sideways. He looked at Clara sleeping. The crescent mark was visible in the low light from the nightlight near the door, faint and unmistakable. And he thought about all the nights this child had slept in this room, in this apartment, in this city, while he'd been sleeping in Sunnyside 30 minutes away. And the geometry of how close and how far those 2 points were simultaneously was something he was still learning to hold without it pulling him into the kind of thinking that didn't help anyone. "I owe you an apology," Evelyn said. He looked at her. "Not for what my father did," she said. "I can't apologize for that. That's his to carry." She had her hands folded in her lap, and she was looking at Clara. "For what I believed, for how quickly I believed it. I was 23 and overwhelmed, and I chose the version of events that let me stop waiting, because waiting was harder than grieving, and She stopped, rearranged something. "I should have fought harder to find out what actually happened." Ryan thought about what he wanted to say to that. He thought about it carefully, because Evelyn was not someone who offered things like this easily, and he wasn't going to respond to it with something that was just pressure release. "I believed my own version too," he said. "I told myself you'd moved on, that you were practical, and I'd been gone too long, and you had a life to run." He paused. "It was easier than the alternative, which was believing that I'd lost something real and had no way to find it." Evelyn turned to look at him. "We were both cowards about it," he said. "Not unkindly, just accurately." "Yes," she said, "we were. So we're even." She looked at him for another moment, then she looked back at Clara. Something in the line of her shoulders changed, not dropped exactly, but released, the way something releases when it has been held at a particular tension for long enough, and the holding finally stops being necessary. "She's going to want to see you tomorrow," Evelyn said. "She's going to have questions about the warehouse, and she's going to want to ask you about it rather than me because she'll think it will upset me." "Will it?" "Probably." A beat. "Answer them anyway. She deserves honest answers more than she needs a protected mother." Ryan nodded. They sat in the quiet for a few more minutes, and then Evelyn stood, and she looked at Clara one more time the way mothers looked at sleeping children, checking, reassuring herself of the specific fact of presence. And then she went to her own room, and Ryan sat alone for a while in the dark beside a child who was his and who had grown up not knowing it, and he let himself feel the full complicated weight of that without trying to make it into something cleaner than it was. He did not feel sitting there like someone who had won something. He felt like someone who had been given a second chance at something that the first chance had not survived, and who understood, clearly and without sentiment, that second chances were not the same as first ones. They were harder and more deliberate and required more from you, not less, precisely because you already knew what it cost to lose the thing. He sat there until he was sure Clara's breathing was still steady. Then he stood up, turned off the nightlight, and went home. Douglas Crane was arrested and charged within 72 hours. Victor Hale, whose real name turned out to be a different name entirely, and whose history with Meridian Consulting Group extended much further back and into much darker territory than even Ryan's contacts had initially mapped, was taken into federal custody 8 days later in a proceeding that had nothing public-facing about it and that Ryan learned about through a single text from one of his contacts that said only, "Done." Harold Sterling's voluntary disclosure had, according to the attorneys managing the process, materially assisted the federal investigation, and while Harold was not untouched by what the disclosure revealed, there were consequences, quiet and significant, of the financial and reputational variety. He was not charged. The decision on that had been Evelyn's, made after a conversation with Ryan that lasted 2 hours and covered ground that neither of them found easy. "He's 71 years old," Evelyn had said. They were sitting in her kitchen after Clara had gone to bed, both of them with coffee that had gone cold. "And he's my father. That doesn't make what he did acceptable. It just means I have to decide what I do with it." "What do you want to do with it?" Ryan asked. "I want to be angry at him for the rest of his life," she said plainly. "And I want Clara to have a grandfather. And those two things don't resolve neatly." "No," Ryan agreed. "They don't." "What would you do?" He considered the question honestly rather than reaching for the answer that sounded right. "I'd let him earn it back. Not forgive it. Let him earn back the right to be in the room. Slowly. With conditions." He paused. "But I'm not Clara's mother, and I'm not his daughter. So the conditions aren't mine to set." Evelyn had looked at him for a long moment. "You could set some of them," she said. "You're her father." He'd felt that sentence land in a way that the word hadn't fully landed before, not because it was the first time he'd thought of himself that way, but because it was the first time she'd said it to him directly, without the buffer of legal language or the softening of context. Her father. Present tense. Factual. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." The conditions they set together were not dramatic. Harold Sterling would be present in Clara's life to the extent that Clara wished him to be present, and not one step beyond that. He would not use his money or his relationships to influence anything related to Clara's upbringing, education, or understanding of her own family's history. He would, when Clara was old enough to ask the questions directly, and Ryan and Evelyn agreed she would ask them, and probably sooner than felt comfortable, answer them honestly. Those were the conditions. Harold accepted them with the particular quietness of a man who understood that he was being offered something he had not earned and knew better than to argue the terms. The first time Harold and Ryan were in the same room was at Clara's school winter concert 3 weeks after the warehouse. It was not a warm reunion. It was two men who occupied the same space with the strained civility of people who had a child in common and a history that was not going to be shortened by proximity. Harold shook Ryan's hand. Ryan shook his. Clara, on the stage in a green dress, played her part in the recorder ensemble with extreme concentration and zero musical distinction, and both men watched her with the particular attention of people who were grateful for reasons that had nothing to do with the recorder. Afterward, in the school hallway, Clara found Ryan first. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the stage door to show him where she'd stood, and Harold Sterling watched from across the hallway as his granddaughter towed a former Navy SEAL through a crowd of second graders with complete authority, and something moved across the old man's face that was too complicated to be called any single thing, but that contained, somewhere in its layers, the specific grief of a man looking at the consequences of his own choices made flesh in a moment he couldn't take back. Ryan saw it. He didn't say anything about it. There was nothing useful to say. The legal formalization of Ryan's parental rights took 4 months, which was faster than Evelyn's attorneys had initially projected, and which Evelyn attributed to having chosen attorneys who understood that speed was the point. Ryan did not fight for anything beyond what was necessary. He did not want sterling money, did not want his name on the company's anything, did not want the life that Evelyn's world offered if it came attached to the conditions that world usually imposed. He wanted time with Clara, consistent and real and unmediated by schedules that treated a child like a quarterly report item. He wanted to be the person she called when something broke, literally or otherwise. He wanted school pickups when it was his week, and bad nights when she couldn't sleep, and the ordinary Wednesday evenings that nobody photographed, and that were, in his experience, the actual substance of a life. He got all of it. The first time Clara stayed overnight at his apartment in Sunnyside, she arrived with a backpack that contained, in addition to clothes and her toothbrush, a small toolkit because she wanted to see if she could fix the radiator in the bedroom that Ryan had mentioned made noise at 2 a.m. She could not fix it. The problem turned out to be structural and would require a professional, but she spent 45 minutes investigating it with a flashlight and a determination that Ryan found both exhausting and completely recognizable. And Eli watched from the doorway with the air of someone observing a new and interesting species in its natural habitat. "Is she always like this?" Eli said quietly to Ryan. "I think so," Ryan said. "Cool," Eli said, and went back to his video game, and that was, with the simplicity that only children could achieve, the extent of the adjustment period. It was not always smooth. Clara and Eli had a genuine argument 3 weeks into the arrangement about whose turn it was to choose the movie on Friday nights that escalated to a volume and intensity that Ryan had not anticipated, and that required him to intervene in the way that parents of multiple children learn. Not by resolving the dispute, but by sending both parties to separate corners until the temperature dropped enough for reason to re-enter the room. Clara was stubborn in the specific way of a child who had been the only child for 6 years and was accustomed to the full weight of adult attention landing on her. Eli was stubborn in the specific way of a child who had lost everything once and held what remained with both hands. These were not incompatible stubbornnesses, exactly, but they required negotiation, and the negotiation was sometimes loud. Ryan handled it imperfectly. He raised his voice once, which he regretted, and apologized to both of them for it, which Clara received with thoughtful seriousness, and Eli received with the shrug of a kid who had already updated his model of Ryan to include the fact that Ryan was human. The apology itself seemed to matter to both of them more than the original volume, which told Ryan something he filed away about what children needed from adults, which was not perfection, but accountability. Evelyn came to Sunnyside for dinner for the first time in February, on a Thursday evening when it was cold enough that the walk from the subway was genuinely unpleasant. She arrived in her good coat and the flat shoes she wore when she was trying not to overdress, and she stood in Ryan's kitchen and watched him cook with an expression that he couldn't entirely read, and that she eventually identified for him, unprompted. "You're actually good at this," she said. Not surprised exactly, more like someone confirming a thing they'd suspected. "I've had practice," he said. He was making pasta, which was the reliable meal, the one that worked for 8-year-olds and 6-year-olds and adults who might have strong feelings about other things. "Marco taught you?" He glanced at her. He'd told her about Marco in pieces over the preceding weeks, who he was, what he'd meant, how Eli had come to be in Ryan's apartment. "Marco could barely boil water," he said. "I taught myself out of necessity. There's a difference between being good at something and having had no alternative." Evelyn considered this. "Most of my skills fall into the second category." "Most people's do," he said. "That's not a bad thing." She set her coat over the back of a chair and asked if she could do anything, and he handed her the garlic without ceremony, and she stood at his counter and minced it with the focused attention she gave to most tasks, and the mild incompetence of someone who was expert at a great many things, and cooking happened not to be among them. The garlic was uneven. Ryan used it anyway. Clara and Eli were doing homework at the kitchen table, or doing the approximate impression of homework that children performed when adults were present, and the alternative was being told to go back to doing it properly. Clara showed Eli how to work a problem. He was stuck on with the particular pleasure of a child who was younger, but had figured something out that the older one hadn't, and Eli accepted the instruction with grace that Ryan suspected was the product of having learned, in harder circumstances than most, that help was something you took when it was offered. It was a Thursday evening in February in a 6th-floor walk-up in Queens, and the radiator knocked twice in the other room and nobody had fixed it yet, and the garlic was uneven, and Eli's homework was half finished, and Clara had a library book she was supposed to have returned 2 days ago sitting in her backpack, and Ryan burned the first piece of bread and threw it away without mentioning it. It was not a perfect evening. It was a real one, which was the better thing. Well, spring came slowly that year, the way New York springs did, cold until it wasn't, the change arriving in a single week that felt less like a transition and more like a sudden decision the weather had made. Clara's school had a science fair in April, and she built a working model of a circuit board that lit up in sequence, and that she explained to the judges with a composure that made her teacher tell Evelyn afterward that Clara had a gift for communicating complex things simply, which Evelyn received with a pride she was still learning to carry without apologizing for. Ryan attended the science fair. He stood beside the circuit board exhibit and listened to Clara explain it to 3 different sets of parents who had wandered over out of genuine interest, and he watched her field questions she hadn't prepared for with the quick, comfortable confidence of a child who trusted her own knowledge. And he thought about the man he'd been 7 years ago, younger, harder in some ways and softer in others, certain of some things he'd turned out to be wrong about, and uncertain of things that had turned out to be true. And he thought that there was nothing that version of himself could have done differently to arrive here faster. The road had the shape it had. The time had gone the way it went. The only question that had ever actually been available to him was what he did when he finally found his way back. He was finding out one Thursday evening and one science fair and one uneven batch of garlic at a time. Evelyn stood beside him during the judging. They were not together in the way that word usually meant. They had not defined it, had not discussed it in the direct terms that adults used when they were trying to establish what a thing was. Because the thing was still finding its own shape, and labeling it prematurely felt like the wrong move for 2 people who had already made the mistake, once, of not being careful enough with something real. But she stood beside him, and when Clara's exhibit placed second and Clara made a face that clearly communicated that she believed she had placed first, and was managing her feelings about this with incomplete success, Evelyn and Ryan both looked at each other at the same moment, and both pressed their mouths together in the particular expression of parents exercising extreme restraint. And the shared restraint was its own kind of closeness, the kind that didn't require a label to be real. "Second is good," Ryan said to Clara on the way out, because someone had to. "The first place one just blinked," Clara said. "Mine had a sequence." "Judges sometimes make decisions based on criteria that aren't obvious from the outside," Evelyn said. Clara considered this. "That's a very diplomatic way of saying they were wrong." "I didn't say that." "You did not say it either." Ryan caught Evelyn's eye over Clara's head and said absolutely nothing, which was the correct move. The foundation that Evelyn established in June was not named after anyone and did not have a grand launch event. It was called the Clear Path Foundation, and its mandate was practical: direct financial support for military families navigating the specific administrative and financial gaps that opened up during deployment, injury, and transition. The gaps that nobody talked about in the recruitment materials, and that swallowed people whole when they were already stretched thin. She funded it from her personal accounts rather than the company's, which made it hers rather than Sterling Industries. And she built its board from people who had lived the problems rather than people who were famous for caring about them. Ryan consulted on the program design. He was not on the board. He didn't want to be on the board. What he wanted was for the thing to actually work, which required honesty about what the real problems were rather than what looked good in a presentation. And he gave Evelyn that honesty with a directness that occasionally made the program director uncomfortable, and that Evelyn, he noticed, never asked him to soften. The training center he opened in Brooklyn in August occupied a former auto shop that he spent 3 months retrofitting with the help of 4 veterans who became his first employees, and who approached the renovation with the specific cooperative competence of people who had learned to build things under worse conditions than a Brooklyn October. The center offered skills training, physical conditioning, and something harder to categorize, a place where men and women who had spent years operating inside a structure that told them exactly who they were and what they were for, could come and figure out who they were and what they were for when that structure was gone. Ryan was not a therapist and didn't pretend to be. He was someone who had navigated that particular disorientation himself and had some practical thoughts about how you came out the other side. The center was not successful immediately. The first month was slow, and the second month was slower, and Ryan spent a Tuesday evening in September looking at the numbers with the resigned honesty of someone who had known this was possible and had decided to do it anyway. Eli came to the center sometimes after school and did his homework in the back office while Ryan ran a session in the main space, and occasionally Eli would wander out and watch. and once a veteran in his late 20s named Torres, who had been coming for 3 weeks and hadn't said much, had stopped mid-exercise to ask Eli what grade he was in, and they'd ended up in a 20-minute conversation about math that Torres seemed to need more than the exercise. Ryan had watched it from the other side of the room and thought that sometimes the thing that helped people wasn't the thing you designed. Sometimes it was the thing that happened in the space you created. The third month was better. The fourth was better still. One morning in October, a Saturday, Ryan was at the kitchen table with coffee and a parts manual for a truck engine he was consulting on for a veteran who wanted to open an auto shop and needed someone to tell him whether the business plan was reasonable. The apartment was quiet, in the specific way it was quiet on Saturday mornings when Eli slept late, which was every Saturday morning without exception. Clara was there for the weekend. She'd arrived Friday night with her toolkit and her library book that was, improbably, the same library book from April, still unreturned. She had been in the living room assembling something for the past 40 minutes. Ryan had not asked what because asking prematurely led to explanations that were longer than the assembly time, and he was reading, and the quiet was good. He heard her stop. He looked up. She was standing in the kitchen doorway with a small model airplane in her hands, one of Eli's, a kit that Eli had started and abandoned because it required more patience than Eli had been willing to locate that particular afternoon. It had been sitting on the shelf in the living room in its incomplete state for 3 weeks. "The left wing is attached wrong," Clara said. "I fixed it, but the adhesive they put in the kit is bad quality and it's not going to hold." "There's better adhesive in the second drawer," Ryan said. She came in, found the drawer, found the adhesive, sat down across from him at the table, and began carefully resecuring the wing with the focus of someone performing a task that required all their attention. Ryan went back to the manual. The Saturday morning quiet resumed. After a while, Clara said, without looking up from the airplane, "Can I call you Dad?" Ryan put the manual down. He looked at his daughter. She was still looking at the airplane, applying pressure to the wing joint with careful fingers, her brow folded in the way it folded when she was concentrating. She had asked the question the way she asked most important questions, quietly, while doing something else, as if the something else provided a kind of cover for the asking. "Clara," he said. She looked up. He held her gaze for a moment. He thought about the long way around that had brought both of them to this kitchen table on this October morning. He thought about the warehouse and the museum and the coffee shop on 67th and the ballroom and the 7 years before all of it. He thought about the fact that this child had arrived at this question on her own, without being pushed toward it or coached into it or given it as an option in a family meeting with a counselor. She had decided, in her own interior way, in her own time, that it was what she wanted, and she had asked for it the way she asked for things she genuinely wanted rather than things she thought she was supposed to want. "You never had to ask," he said. Clara looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded. In the decisive way she nodded when she had received information she considered correct, and she went back to the airplane. Ryan sat there for a moment with his coffee and his manual and the quiet. Then Eli appeared in the doorway in his pajamas, with his hair at an angle that suggested he had fallen asleep on it wrong. And he looked at Clara and the airplane and said, with the slow assessment of someone recently woken, "Did you fix my plane?" "The wing was wrong," Clara said. "I was going to fix it." "You've been going to fix it for 3 weeks. Eli considered this. "Yeah, fair." He looked at Ryan. "Is there coffee?" "You're 8, Ryan said. "Hot chocolate?" "Stove. Pot's already on." Eli shuffled to the stove. Clara held the wing in place. Ryan picked up the manual. The radiator knocked once in the other room and went quiet. It was an ordinary Saturday morning. That was exactly what it was and exactly what it was worth. 1 year after the gala, Evelyn received an invitation to the same Waldorf charity event. She almost declined it. Then she thought about it for a day and called Ryan and said she wanted to go and wanted him to come with her and wanted to bring both kids, which was logistically complicated and probably inadvisable for a 6- and 8-year-old in a formal ballroom setting, and Ryan said sure. They walked in together on a Friday night in November. Clara in the navy dress she'd refused to give up despite having grown half an inch since she'd first worn it, and Eli in a blazer that he'd put on without complaint because Clara had told him he looked good in it, which was the only persuasion that worked. Evelyn in something dark and simple. Ryan in a suit that was better than the security uniform and that he wore with the comfortable lack of self-consciousness of someone who had never placed much value on what they were wearing. The ballroom was the same, the chandeliers and the string quartet and the 500 people performing their careful versions of themselves. 1 year ago to the evening, a small girl in this room had stopped walking and looked at a stranger and asked a question that rearranged everything. Clara walked between Ryan and Evelyn for a while, holding both their hands, looking at the room with the systematic attention she gave to new environments. Then she looked up at Ryan and said, with the directness she had inherited from both of them, in a concentration that was probably going to be a significant problem for everyone around her as she got older, "This is where I saw you." "Yeah," Ryan said. "It is." "I knew something was different about you," she said, "from across the room." "What did you know?" She thought about it in the serious way she thought about things she wanted to get right. "I didn't know what, just that something was." She looked back at the room. "I was right." "You were right," Ryan said. A photographer from the event's press team approached and asked if they'd like a photo. Clara immediately repositioned herself between Ryan and Evelyn and straightened her dress with both hands, in a way that managed to be simultaneously vain and completely unself-conscious. Eli stood at Ryan's other side, with the mild, cooperative air of a kid who was fine with photos as long as they didn't take too long. The photographer asked them to smile. Clara said, "This time, everybody knows he's my dad." The photographer laughed. Ryan did not smile in the practiced way of someone performing for a camera. He smiled in the way of someone who had not expected to feel what he was feeling and was feeling it anyway, which was a harder thing to perform and an impossible thing to fake. And the photograph, when Evelyn saw it 3 days later on the event's website, showed it clearly on his face, not the handsome, composed expression of a man who knew a camera was on him, but the real thing, the kind that reached the eyes, the kind that happened to you rather than the kind you made happen. She sent it to him with no message. He responded with a single word. "Yeah." She knew what he meant. She kept the photograph. What happened between them in the months that followed was not a fairy tale, and neither of them would have wanted it to be, because fairy tales happened to people who had not yet learned what things actually cost, and both of them had paid enough to know the difference between a story and a life. What happened was slower and more specific than that. A conversation on a park bench in March that lasted 2 hours passed when either of them had meant to stay. A dinner that ended with Evelyn falling asleep on Ryan's couch because the exhaustion of a 14-hour workday had caught up to her between the salad and the coffee. A morning when Ryan showed up at the Sterling apartment with 2 cups of actual coffee and a bag of the specific pastry that Clara had declared at some point to be the only acceptable Saturday breakfast. And Evelyn had opened the door and looked at him with the straightforward, unguarded look of someone who had stopped performing not needing someone and was simply glad he was there. They did not announce anything. They did not have a defining conversation about what they were. What they had was something that built itself quietly in the spaces between the larger events, in school pickups and Sunday dinners, and the evenings when Ryan stayed late after Clara went to sleep, and they talked, the way people talked when they trusted each other, about things that mattered and things that didn't, in roughly equal measure. Evelyn, who had spent 30 years learning to need no one and had been very good at it, found that needing someone was not the diminishment she'd been afraid of. It was the opposite thing. It was what happened when you finally put down something heavy you'd been carrying so long you'd stopped feeling the weight of it and discovered that your hands were free. Ryan, who had spent 7 years building a life around the fixed point of what he could provide rather than what he might want, found that wanting something was not the vulnerability he'd learned to avoid. It was the thing that made the providing mean anything. It was the reason the ordinary Saturdays mattered. It was the weight behind the showing up. There was still the distance of what had been lost. There would always be that. 6 years that Clara had grown without him, that he had spent in the particular incomplete way of a man who had learned to be whole around a missing thing. Those years did not come back. Ryan had no illusion that they would, and he'd made his peace with the idea that making peace with something was different from being at peace with it. That you could accept a thing as true and still feel its edges, and that feeling the edges was not failure, it was just honesty. But there was also what they had now, and what they were building. And Clara at the kitchen table with the model airplane asking her question in the careful sideways way of someone who needed the asking to be simple because the wanting was enormous. You never had to ask. That was the thing about family, Ryan had come to understand. Not the kind you were born into, which was luck, good or bad, but the kind you chose, which was something else entirely. The kind you chose required you to keep choosing it. Not once, in a grand gesture or a legal document or a ballroom photograph, but in the accumulation of ordinary decisions, to show up on a Tuesday when there was no particular reason to fix the thing that was broken, to sit in the chair beside the bed until you were sure the breathing was still even, to drive 30 minutes across a city at 11 o'clock at night because someone needed you to know where to look. Ryan Cole had spent 7 years believing he was looking for something he'd lost. He had not been wrong about that. He had only been wrong about what it was. It was not a moment or a woman or a chapter of his life that had ended before it should have. It was this specific, imperfect, unfinished, ongoing thing, this family, built from what had survived the distance and the lies and the years between. These two children growing up in adjacent boroughs, arguing about movies and helping each other with homework and making of each other, without being asked to and without making a thing of it, the irreplaceable ordinary thing called a sibling. This woman, who had run her own life with a capability that he genuinely admired, and who had learned, slowly and at some cost, to let him be present in it. This Saturday morning, this kitchen, this coffee that was still warm enough. He had survived the years between so he could finally come home. And home, it turned out, was not a place. It was the people who looked up when you walked in the door, and the particular quality of quiet that meant everyone who was supposed to be there was there, and the radiator knocking in the other room that nobody had fixed yet, and that it was possible nobody ever would, and the fact that it didn't matter, because the noise was part of it now, part of the sound of a life that was real and imperfect and his. He picked up his coffee. He went back to his reading. Across the table, Clara held the airplane wing in place and waited for the adhesive to set, patient in the way of someone who understood that some things required time, and that time, given honestly, was usually enough.